Welcome back to Movies TV Mad. You can follow me on Twitter at Movies TV Mad, on Instagram Movies TV Mad X, and on TikTok Mick Isn't Perfect, because guess what? Mick isn't perfect, so let the insults fly. So, a bolt out of the blue then, Lucasfilm have appointed Dave Filoni as the Chief Creative Officer of Star Wars or Lucasfilm or whatever they're calling it. Now, this is a very interesting, desperate decision. There's two scenarios here. Either this is a bullshit kind of title which will mean nothing and they're just trying to bring, consumer confidence back into Disney Star Wars, or this is them firing Kathleen Kennedy and replacing her without firing Kathleen Kennedy, and Filoni actually will start to develop his own Star Wars universe and projects. Some people will say, well, look at The Mandalorian Season 4. Look at Ahsoka. It hasn't worked out so well for Filoni. It's very interesting that it's all gone quiet on the Jon Favreau front. He was very much involved in the early stages of The Mandalorian, but he doesn't seem to be doing much talking anymore. It's almost like he's barely not involved with Star Wars anymore, and he's been squeezed out. Of course, there was rumours of a power struggle, where you had Favreau and Filoni on one side and Kennedy on the other. Few years later, we suddenly heard Favreau and Filoni speaking very highly of Kathy and how they couldn't do the job without her. What utter bullshit. Welcome to Hollywood. Welcome to the bullshit train, everyone. I know all about this industry. And if you want to follow a content creator who grew up being dragged from film set and TV set to film set and TV set, someone who understands these people and how these people think, then you are at the right place. If you just want to click onto the Fandom Menace where they rant and rave and know jack all, that's up to you. If you want to be informed, stay here on Movies TV Mad, because I am absolutely Movies TV Mad. So it's all very interesting stuff. So first of all, let's talk about The Mandalorian Season 4 and Ahsoka, and talk about the lack of quality. Then the lack of quality, obviously, with Kenobi, which Dave and Favreau had very little to do with. So there could be an easy explanation why Dave dropped the ball with Ahsoka and with The Mandalorian Season 4, because Kennedy was interfering. It could be now, if this is a genuine title that Filoni has, that he can actually do a good job if she's just there sharpening pencils. And this is the big question, everyone. We don't know what her position is. It's clear that her time at Lucasfilm is running out, but it's a very complicated issue, as I told you at the time. It was George Lucas's insistence that she was made president of Lucasfilm. That role is tied in to Lucas's arrangement. That was the provisions around the sale to Disney, that Kennedy had to be involved. Now, we have to ask the question about George Lucas, because the man who created Star Wars clearly is a very smart guy. He must have known how useless this woman is, how extremist she is, how extreme left she is, and all of that, and everything she's done, the Force is female, blah, 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 blah. Here's another problem. It's not just Kennedy, that's the problem. Disney are a very far left progressive company. So even without Kennedy, you're still gonna have to put up with that progressiveness. They're not going to change. That's obvious. But if they don't change, they're gonna go bankrupt. So it will be very interesting if they just allow Filoni to do his thing. And if they do, there could be a chance at some modicum of success. But here's another thing that most Star Wars fans don't want to accept. It's very difficult to make good Star Wars without George Lucas. Now, I said it from the beginning. Once they rejected Lucas's pitch at a Skywalker sequel trilogy, they should have dropped the idea of a sequel trilogy. And when Snyder came knocking with the Rebel Moon pitch, that was the best way forward. Even if they didn't take Snyder on or his pitch, his idea of moving it on away from the Skywalkers, introducing new planets and new characters, was the best way to go. Because the Skywalkers have been done and done again. In fact, the Skywalkers have been done more than a hooker on a very profitable night. And the only person who understands the Skywalker saga is George Lucas. So if you're not going to accept his pitch on a sequel trilogy, which is something us fans were desperate to get for years and years. In fact, one of the things that me and Star Wars fans used to discuss, let's hope George Lucas doesn't die before he can write and direct, the sequel trilogy of the Skywalker saga. But Iger, as he said in his book, rejected that. He lied to George Lucas and then he dumped it until once Lucas signed on the dotted line. But Lucas is a clever guy. I believe Lucas knew that Kennedy is a nightmare, that she would lead to this, and I think that Lucas got his revenge. There's no way he thought insisting Kennedy would be involved, would be running Star Wars, would be a good idea. And this is revenge for George. For all you people who bullied him and wrote horrible letters to him about Jar Jar Binks and the prequels, and I think now he's sitting back laughing his fucking Jedis off. I really do. I think because nobody can be as attacked as Lucas was back then and not want to get some payback. He said he sold Lucasfilm to Disney because he didn't want to be involved anymore because of the fan attacks. And that's a fact. George was very much hurt by you prequel haters because you couldn't accept that this was his baby and he had a vision. For me, the prequels was a very, very good vision. No, it wasn't the original trilogy. It was never supposed to be. George didn't believe in just, rifling out the same old shit. No, there was no Han Solo character. He was trying to tell you how it began. Did George become like a child at Christmas using CGI too much? Probably, but that was his prerogative. I love the prequels. I think they're great and they do a very interesting story about a dictator who manipulates a democracy. It's an amazing, brilliant story. But no one's going to convince me that George didn't know what was going to happen. So is Filoni's appointment as Chief Creative Officer, a title, by the way, that Jeff Johns had at DC when he was running the DCEU? How well did that work out? Because when he was given it, we all thought, yes, Jeff Johns is one of the great comic book writers. He wrote some great episodes of Smallville. He's a DC fan. He used to work with Dick Donner. This is the way to go. And look how that worked out. Dave Filoni has always had this hero status with Star Wars fans because of the Clone Wars. But it's one thing to develop a great animated Star Wars universe, and it's another to create a live-action universe, because the question is, and the question that no one's got an answer for, what can you do with Star Wars? Do you do some prequels? Do you go further into the future? Because Star Wars will never be the Star Wars of George Lucas. And if Star Wars is never going to be the Star Wars of George Lucas, you have to ask another question. What's the point of it? Because that's the reason Star Wars was so profitable. Even with the controversial prequel trilogy, toys were sold, merch was sold. Each one of those films made an abundance of money. They were successful despite the controversy around them. Because even with The Phantom Menace, there's good things you can take away from that movie, like the pod race, the double lightsaber, the saber fight between Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan and Darth Maul. Darth Maul, another brilliant concept. There are good things that you can take away from a film like The Phantom Menace, even though you don't like it. I mean, there's good things you can take from The Force Awakens. It's not a totally bad film. It's just a rinse and repeat film. They dumped Lucas's pitch of a sequel trilogy and literally ripped off A New Hope. That's what they did. What they did made absolutely no sense. So why did they reject Lucas's pitch? They rejected it because Lucas's name was mud with a lot of Star Wars fans because of the prequels. And they thought bringing him back wasn't good for business. And you know what? At the time when I was on Twitter, a lot of Star Wars fans who won't admit it said, if George Lucas is involved, I won't watch these films. That's how bad the hatred was for George Lucas. Ridiculous. So all the fans crying about the woke culture at Disney and in Hollywood, you did this to yourselves. Because if you didn't attack George Lucas so badly, you didn't have to like the prequels. You could have just been more constructive with your criticism. You drove him out of Lucasfilm. That's what you did. And you created this new situation. Because if Lucas still owned Lucasfilm, you know, even though if we're surrounded by woke culture, Lucas wouldn't have been corrupted by that. And we still would have seen some very interesting Star Wars projects. And eventually he could have got going on his own sequel trilogy. If anyone's to blame for George Lucas selling to Disney, I'm sorry, it's a section of the Star Wars fandom. Because you never really got it that whose baby Star Wars was. It was George Lucas's baby. That takes us right round to this interesting, desperate appointment of Dave Filoni as Chief Creative Officer. Is it a bullshit title, or is it, can we see change? It's very, very interesting. My thinking right now is, and just listening to some of the shit that Filoni has said in the past, although he's been echoing Kennedy because he had no choice, because basically at one point I think it was Filoni and Favreau versus Kennedy, and for some reason they were brought to the table to be more, you know, more supportive to her take of Star Wars. So how can we deem if Filoni actually is running things now? Well, Kennedy announced a lot of projects, like the continuation of Rey Skywalker and her saga and her story and things like that. All those projects, if they are cancelled, then you will see that Filoni is absolutely in charge. If they carry on with Kennedy's movies, that means Filoni isn't truly in charge. Now, the statement reads that he'll be working alongside Kathleen Kennedy. If that's the truth, we're in the same mess and predicament as before. But if that's just to save Kathy's face and he's literally in charge, I think we could get some real change at Star Wars. Because make no mistake about it, they need Star Wars to be successful. They've sunk a lot of money into it. They're selling off some things to other places, but they're not willing yet to sell off Marvel Studios and Lucasfilm. Now, if they continue to fail and keep on making the mistakes of the magnitude they're making, then they will have to sell, because Disney are in a really huge financial mess. So Star Wars has to be successful. They can't just pretend Filoni's going to enact change here. He has to enact change. So it's all about how things look. So don't be surprised if George Lucas is given some title by Dave Filoni in the coming weeks as some kind of consultant. Because I think we're at the time now when no Star Wars fan bears George any ill will, and suddenly they're all looking at him via rose-coloured glasses. Maybe you should have thought about that before you attacked his vision of Star Wars, something the man created himself, which means he had every right to do whatever the fuck he wanted with it. That's my stance. But do expect George to be appointed as some kind of consultant. Whether they'll be using him as a consultant, but he has been around Filoni when Filoni's Star Wars projects have been made. They have wheeled him out so we can see George with David. It pretty much brings confidence to the consumer. But when you look at Mandalorian Season 4, when you look at Ahsoka, I think you can see that George had very, very little to do with those projects. But it's very interesting because there's a few Kennedy projects still to come. There's the Skeleton Key crew and there's the other one, you know, so will those projects be released or will they be shelved? That's another interesting question, because releasing those projects will bring more negativity, something that Disney and Lucasfilm and Dave Filoni just don't need.